To our panelists tonight, they bring a wide range of perspectives and a lot of expertise to the issue. And they'll be able to speak to immigration's place in the American economy, culture, and national security. So I'll start. I'll introduce our panelists. We have Jeremy Neufeld, who's the Senior Immigration Fellow at the Institute for Progress, where he leads the immigration policy portfolio. Previously, he was an immigration policy analyst for the Hammond Center. His work has been cited in numerous outlets, including the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and MSNBC. He graduated with a BS in economics from the University of Maryland College Park, and is currently an economics PhD student at George Mason University. Next, we have Helen Andrews, senior editor at the American Conservative and the author of Boomers, The Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster. She's worked at the Washington Examiner and National Review, and is a think tank researcher at the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies from Yale University. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, First Things, the Claremont Review of Books, Hedgehog Review, and many others. And last but not least, Samuel Hammond, senior economist at FAI, where his research focuses on innovation and science policy and the institutional impact of disruptive technologies. He previously worked as the director of social policy for the Niskanen Center, where he remains a senior fellow, as an economist for the Government of Canada, specializing in regional economic development, and as a graduate research fellow for the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. So I think we should start, as many policymakers do, with the economic side of immigration. Some policymakers say that immigration leads to lower wages and fewer jobs for native-born workers. Others say it raises wages and leads to job creation. How do you assess those views, and what impact generally does immigration have on American workers? And if you want to start with Jeremy and then move down the line.
Sure. I think immigration is a real secret ingredient in American technological and economic leadership around the world. It's key to America's dynamism, and I think the key reason for that is it's renewing the kind of risk-taking entrepreneurial spirit that drives the American economy and has been key to its success for a long time. The kinds of people who come to the United States are those who are willing to risk it all, and that's exactly the kinds of people who succeed at starting new businesses and driving economic growth. And on the wage question, I think a lot of the wage debate and the economics of immigration can be kind of myopic. Even the most pessimistic of the economists on wages, George Borjas, grants that on average, immigrants increase wages. There's a strong distributional effect here, which I'm sure we can get into. But at some level, we're talking about a few percentage points on wages. But much more importantly, in the long run, than the ratio of labor to capital is technological innovation. This is what's driving long-term wage growth in the United States. And here, we see that immigration has huge effects that dwarf any short-run wage effects which people can debate for decades. Here we see that immigrants start companies at much higher rates than natives because we're selecting for risk-taking entrepreneurial people. And these aren't just small businesses, but they also include the most highest growth potential businesses that are creating far more jobs than immigrants can take themselves. And on this technological innovation point, I think this is really key. If you look at patents, again, immigrants are producing high quality patents at a much higher rate than natives. And this isn't just immigrants are better than us in some way, but they bring, one we're selecting for very highly educated people, but they also bring ideas that haven't had much exposure in US invention. And so when those ideas get combined with the ideas of natives, it increases innovation among the new immigrants, and it increases innovation among the natives who get to work with them. And all of this, you wrap all of this together, you get 50% of our Fortune 500 companies founded by immigrants. You get immigrants responsible for something like 40% of US inventions, 40% of Nobel Prizes in science. And if we want to stay the world's economic and technological leader, we're going to need to keep one of our key ingredients to that, which is going to be immigration.
Is this working? Is my audio audible? Great. So I have, in many ways, the worst job here tonight because I'm set up to be the bad guy. Jeremy gets to talk about all these great, interesting entrepreneurs and immigrant founders, you know, like Sergey Brin or Elon Musk or Parag Agrawal. Maybe not Parag. And it's my job to pour cold water and say, okay, well, how many immigrants do we need to accept to the United States in order to get one Elon Musk? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? Is it 10,000? Or 100,000? And what will be the effect on the United States of the other 99,000? Because, of course, when we're talking about high-skilled immigration to the United States, we are, by and large, not talking about super geniuses of an Elon Musk caliber. We're talking about things like H-1B visas. Now, that visa was created and sold as a way for people with special skills that were rare or not in sufficient supply in the United States to come here and work for American companies. If you look at what H-1B visa workers are doing in the United States today, these are not the best and the brightest doing work that Americans can't do. These are people doing turnkey programming jobs. So when we're talking about high-skilled immigration, we have to look at the whole and not just the especially appealing anecdotes. And so the first thing to do in evaluating the phenomenon is to consider its scale. When you think about, you know, getting an H-1B visa for your company, it might be that there's one guy that you really want in the rest of the company. So just for a guess, looking at the STEM workforce in the United States, what share do you think is foreign born? It's 5%? It's 10%? It's closer to 25%. 1 in 4 STEM workers in the United States is foreign born. And of course in some disciplines that's a lot higher. For software engineers it's 40%. In some localities it's a lot higher. In some U.S. counties, majorities of STEM workers. I think a majority of tech workers in Silicon Valley are foreign born. So it's certainly a phenomenon of sufficient scale that it's going to be having effects on things like wages. And I think that increasing the size of your workforce by 30%, by adding that fourth person in the 1 in 4, will inevitably have an effect on wages. There is some evidence that cities with higher levels of immigration have lower birth rates for native-born moms. There's also some evidence that, did I mention STEM graduate programs? Also heavily dominated by the foreign-born. Electrical engineering programs, I think something like 80% of currently enrolled full-time graduate students in electrical engineering in the United States are foreign-born. So there's some evidence that the predominance of foreign-born students in these programs causes Americans to divert into other fields. An interesting statistic that I always like to ponder as giving some indication of where the American economy is going is what fields MIT graduates decide to pursue upon graduation. Finance was in 2003 something like 15% of MIT graduates, the field that they went into. That increased rapidly and is now closer to I think 30%. So doubling in the space of 2 decades. And that's because if you're a highly skilled American and you see that the field of computer science is one where large companies are able to bring in large numbers of H-1B visa holders to do the same jobs more cheaply than Americans can do them, you think that pursuing that field is going to be a bad bet. So you have native-born American potential innovators deciding to avoid STEM fields because they think they won't be able to get sufficient good jobs. So there are a lot of trade-offs, and I think that as that's our job as conservatives. We're always the bad guys in debates. The left wants to come up with fun things and have cool new programs and lots of handouts, and we're always the guys in the back saying, yeah, but how are you going to pay for it? What are the trade-offs? And I think that's really what we have to do when we're looking at high-scale immigration policy.
Yeah, so I'm Canadian, so I sort of have a bit of a conflict of interest here. But I think it's worth, bringing some of my Canadian perspective to this debate because, American politics is very often lacking in sort of comparative politics. We think there wasn't a pilot program in Wisconsin that didn't happen. And in the case of immigration, I think the debate ends up becoming either pro or con, as if it was just some binary, whether you're for or against immigration. There's very different kinds of immigration regimes, very different kinds of immigration motivations, and a rich experience in different countries that we can learn from. So, I think the conventional economic answer as an economist to the question, does immigration affect wages, is on the whole, no. And that's because of what economists call the lone labor fallacy. Any warm body that comes to the United States, including babies that grow up and become adults, workers, and consumers, they don't just supply labor, they also spend their income, which creates new demand and basically offsets whatever whatever supply that they're producing. That doesn't mean, so if we had a program that was only bringing in nurses, right, then yes, that would affect the wages of nurses because supply and demand is a real model of how the economy works. But it wouldn't affect wages across the board. It would affect that particular sector. The other thing that can affect wages is the terms of immigration, right? So I'm technically a guest worker, right? So I'm being exploited by big think tank because I can't, if I write for American Conservative, I can't actually take that money because I own all my income, I come through my employer. They had to do an extensive, labor impact assessment to make sure that there was a shortage of contrarian to online writers. When you have a guest worker program like that, or like the program that they have in Qatar, right, which actually a significant portion of their whole population goes to building the FIFA, the World Cup stadium and stuff like that, that is a source of genuine exploitation. And the reason is not because of immigration per se, but because of the terms of the employment. If you took natives and told them that they can only work for one company, they would be exploited as well, and they would also suppress wages. And so when I look to Canada, what makes Canada special, and I think it's worth studying especially for American conservatives who pay lip service to a points-based system, is not only do we have a points-based system where we select heavily for economic migrants, the majority of immigrants to Canada come as what we call permanent residents. They're not guest workers, they come with the expectation that they're going to be there forever with the legal right to switch employers. And that greatly offsets the sense in which these are sort of just substituting for an American job market. And I think this is a perspective that ends up being missed in the debate because there are people who are paid by, big tech to come defend the H-1B program, and they're going to deny that they have problems, right? And there are people who come from the top-to-top perspective, and they're going to also only see one side of the issue. And the reality is, we do need more skilled labor in the United States, and we should be trying to intentionally select that, not for humanitarian reasons, but for our own national interests. In Canada was a country of 30 million, a decade ago now, we're approaching 40 million. In Canada, growing population is part of our national security strategy, right? Because population equates to the size of the economy, which equates to global economic power. In the U.S., we sort of have this luxury of being somewhere in the middle. We're not India with 1.2 billion, or we're not China. But population doesn't matter, and a lot of the decline in America, as in rural areas, for example, comes from the fact that populations are declining, both because of low birth rates, but also because of outmigration. So there's lots of immigration, lots of higher immigration can do to support a bigger, stronger America, but it has to come from that logic. And I think one of the issues in the United States, versus vis-a-vis Canada and other countries, is that our logic, the American logic in immigration, the way it's talked about, tends to be more humanitarian, right? It tends to be, we are, the deciding city on the hill, like, you know, bring your poor huddled masses, you're going to be free. And the issue of that, and I think the issue conservatives have with that, is it doesn't have a limiting principle, right? Whereas if you frame it as immigration is good for the country and it's actually international interest, that both changes the nature of the debate, but it also changes how we should design the immigration system. We should design the system, you know, off of what borrowing from Raihan Salam. Instead of being restrictionist, we should be selectionist. We should be using our power and the fact that so many people around the world want to come here to select the best and the brightest, and to not make them guest workers or indentured servants, but to give them freedom to work and build companies and move between employers. And we shouldn't pair that with a reduction in total immigration. We should pair that with strong immigration enforcement, which is another issue that also often gets confused in the United States, where the people who are most pro-immigration are also the most skeptical of E-Verify and these other sort of systems. In Canada, the reason we have so much support, only 2% of the public thinks immigration is a national issue. The reason we have so much support for immigration, which is, again, 1.1% of our population growth every year is our new immigrants. Talk about foreign-born population. Toronto's 50% foreign-born. I don't know about the STEM sector, but if Toronto as a whole is 50% foreign-born, I don't think it's a problem. But the reason it has widespread public support is both because it's in the national interest and because we know it's controlled and has enforcement. And that enforcement comes through our employers. In the U.S., even Donald Trump couldn't agree on Fox News when asked point blank, would you embrace national E-Verify? And so American immigration politics is stuck in a sort of an impasse with people who want higher rates of immigration but resist employer enforcement, and people on the right who want the opposite. But actually the only stable solution is to embrace strong enforcement, and that will actually enable higher rates.
Roger, would you like to respond?
Will we go down the line again?
Sure. I think I essentially agree with Sam on this importance of selection. If I think about the problems with the H-1B, for instance, people being brought in to train their replacements, I don't think these are representative stories, but they're largely based on the fact that there's no selection mechanism on the H-1B visa. We give them out by lottery. There's no benefit for an employer to actually recruit the best person because they're going to get just the same chance of getting a visa as someone who just makes the minimum qualifications for eligibility. And this was something that the Trump administration tried to solve. And this, I think, would have helped a lot with these wage issues. And I also agree with Sam on the fact that Canada doesn't share one of the longest borders with a net immigration country. It's going to make immigration much more popular there. But I also think this points-based system that they have also creates the public perception that it's working for Canadians. I think we learn a lot from them, both on the selection of immigrants and on the numbers of immigrants.
Yeah, no, even Trump speaks favorably of the Canadian point system, so I think that's fine. I think I will issue a piece of advice to the people in the audience here as you go home and investigate the economics of high-skilled immigration and whether it raises wages or doesn't. It is advice by way of an economist who has already been cited today, George Borjas. His most recent book, I think most recent, We Wanted Workers, which comes from something said by, I believe, a Swiss bureaucrat. We wanted workers, but we got people instead, speaking of this kind of immigration. The most interesting thing in the Borjas book to me was not any argument he made or any statistic he supplied, but his description of the discipline of economics as it looks at him from the inside. And he told two anecdotes that everyone here should keep in mind. The first was a conversation he had with the economist Julian Simon, big deal, towering titan field. He was showing Simon some work he'd done showing the negative effects of immigration on native workers, and Simon said, you don't want to go into this because you're going to give aid and comfort to the xenophobes. You don't want to produce any work that's going to make it seem like you're friendly with these racist, horrible restrictionists. You don't want to make people think you're on their side. And then the second was a reference to something that the economist Paul Collier actually committed to print. He wrote in a book of his, naturally the issue of immigration attracts many racists and xenophobes. As a consequence, social scientists have strained every muscle to make it seem as if immigration is good for everyone. The thing that Borjas took away from those two anecdotes is that there is massive groupthink and even pressure within the discipline of economics to get people to produce papers and arguments and facts and statistics that point in a certain direction. And there is huge discouragement applied to anybody who might supply economic arguments to the contrary. And if there's anything we know from the history of science, is that facts do not simply emerge from the ether. They are produced by human beings, economists, who care about the esteem of their peers and who care about what kind of career they're going to have 10 years from now. So I think the pressure that exists within the expert class on the issue of immigration is greater than on any other subject that economics looks at, because all of the pressure is on one side. So just keep that in mind as you're evaluating as expert testimony, that tech companies can pay a lot of money to economists to produce arguments favorable to them, and the restriction side, trust me, does not pay very well.
I think this is a good transition for our next section, as well as this point about American logic of immigration and selectionism. So if you think about the cultural dimensions, immigration has impacts on American culture and institutions. Some people argue on the negative that people bring negative traits from their home countries, from their countries of origin, that they negatively impact social cohesion, civic life, public safety. Others say a diverse set of newcomers leads to richer culture, new opportunities to collaborate. Where do you guys fall on that spectrum? What are some things that would help promote, or currently are helping promote, social cohesion with immigration? Sam, do you want to start?
Sure, again, and I'm going to be a roadrunner of this to looking at Canada. One of the ways that we can construct a points-based system is, again, not trying to find the best and brightest, the Einstein, which you should take, but they're too few in number to actually make up most of what immigration means. But what we can use the immigration system to do is to bolster the middle class. And liberalism, in the broad sense, liberal democracy rests on a strong bourgeoisie, a strong middle. And one of the outcomes of the Canadian approach to this policy has been that we're basically poaching the middle classes of countries around the world. The average immigrant to Canada has $2,000 in savings. They have a bachelor's degree. They're very civic-minded. There are many cultural differences around the world, but there are also class differences that cut across those cultures. And among the middle class, having sort of a strong work ethic, a kind of Calvinist sort of approach to like high expectations and so forth. That's true across different populations, and that's sort of when you go to like the Greater Toronto suburbs and so forth. You see like the Sikhs and the Vietnamese, and they all have like the same sort of aspirational kind of ethic. And I think it's actually a way in which we can lean against something that Helen has written a lot about, the boomers, right? And the boomers being the outcome or the cause and the effect of the 60s and the sort of rejection of bourgeois values, right? Immigrants do not come with those values; they come with really hardcore work ethic, right? And in addition to that, I think there's among conservatives a desire or like a longing to have a kind of one nation conservatism. Sort of, if only Roosevelt said that no American should be a hyphenated American, right? That's Teddy Roosevelt. I think that's actually a mistake, and especially as sort of the culture war heats up and conservatives have rejected sort of wokeism and so forth. Wokeism is an all-American ideology, really, and it is also the ideology of kind of social gospel, kind of deconstructed Protestant ethic, right, that sort of comes from the WASP and so forth. If you want to mess with that, right, bring more Nigerians to the country, right? Never met someone who's more based than Nigerian immigrants. And nothing that will fuck more with American culture or politics than super right-wing immigrants from other countries that all they want is to be accepted to the university on merit and to have low taxes and to be left alone, and also to not have CRT taught in schools, right? And this is actually played out in Canada, where everyone has heard of Rob Ford, the crack smoking mayor of Toronto. Rest in peace. His younger brother, Doug Ford, is a premier, and so the Ford Nation in Toronto was sort of like a parallel to Trumpism or Steve Bannon, sort of the populist talk radio type people. They only have political power because of the immigrant vote, and a lot of that came out of actually debates that are very parallel to conservatives today in terms of curriculum and stuff like that. In Toronto, the Liberal premier at the time wanted to introduce this K-12 curriculum upgrade that would have, by some accounts, taught anal sex to 1-year-olds, right? And it sort of parallels some of the serious stuff. Guess who that coalition? Guess what kind of coalition came out of that, right? The recent immigrants and the Christian right, right? And they were like, we don't want this taught in our schools. And so I think there's a way in which, immigrants, and Jeremy probably will set the stats on, the rate of assimilate. They do assimilate. They do learn English. They do become citizen participants. But the elements of our culture that are actually bad, maybe shouldn't be assimilated to, right? Like I do worry that you talk about classic birth rates, that maybe our immigration rates are too low. Like I kind of look at the Hispanic birth rates and see that they're converging to the white native rate, and I'm like, whoa, maybe this is bad. Like maybe the assimilation is happening too quickly. So it's a double-edged sword. I think it's not a unidimensional thing where like immigrants affect the culture. We can select immigrants based on sort of common class concerns and help fill in the missing middle of the American middle class. Right now, the status quo in America is to sort of take low-skilled immigrants who come in through either illegally or through family and so forth, or we take the high end, and so we have a sort of barbell structure to our immigration system. Taking a more intentional approach can help fill in that missing middle and probably bolster or help recreate a politics that I think folks like Helen would see themselves in.
So when we talk about immigrants affecting social cohesion, most of the time we're talking about things like crime and lack of educational attainment. Those are the metrics we use when we're evaluating whether a group of immigrants is assimilating well and flourishing. And by all of those standards, Asian Americans are doing great. They're doing better than us. They're high marriage rates, they have higher educational attainment than natives, higher income than natives. But I think the story of the last 30 years is that that's not the whole picture when it comes to assimilation. I got myself into a little bit of trouble on Twitter the other day, as that's what Twitter's for, by flagging an anecdote out of California, Fremont, California. There's a public school there that went from being 80% white in 1990 to being over 80% Asian today. And as soon as the crossover happened and the school became mainly Asian, the first thing they did was cancel football. That school no longer has a football program. It had been statewide competitive. And I got a lot of people on Twitter saying, good, that's smart kids. They don't want to play traumatic brain injury the game. Maybe they'll spend their time doing something worthwhile, like studying, rather than getting themselves concussions. I disagree strongly with that. I'm going to come out tonight and say I am firmly in favor of high school football. It is a good thing. It teaches good values, and there may be cultures out there in which high school football would not be favored, but this is America, and we play high school football. So it's possible that immigrants will assimilate to American culture as measured by things like liking high school football, but there are troubling signs on certain metrics of assimilation for Asian American groups one good metric for whether a group is assimilating into America or not is intermarriage. Do they marry other Americans? Do they marry outside of their immigrant group? For Indian Americans, something like 90%, between 85 and 90% marry other Indians, so very low intermarriage rates. For Chinese, 75% of Chinese immigrants, and also native-born Chinese, native-born Chinese Americans marry someone else of Chinese descent. So intermarriage is not really happening, which is not a problem. They don't have to marry other people. But that is an indication that assimilation and melting into the great American melting pot is not quite happening. I do have to respond to the based immigrant thesis. I have met some based Nigerian immigrants, and them, I would make them king of America. That would not be a problem with me. However, it is simply false that immigrants, Asian American immigrants in particular, are more conservative than immigrants. What share of the Asian American vote do you think Joe Biden got? What share of the Indian American vote do you think he got? 80%. Yeah. Korean American, 80%. Chinese American also, I think, around the 70s. The Asian American vote is a solid, overwhelmingly solid. They are more in the bag for the Democrats than Hispanic voters are. So that's, and even Glenn Youngkin, who kind of did a anti-CRT, we don't want to teach your kids sex when they're 5 years old kind of campaign, he got the same share of the Asian vote in Virginia, where it matters, as Donald Trump. He did not do very well. All of the arguments Glenn Youngkin made, which should have appealed to Asian voters as the stereotype exists in our minds, apparently didn't do him any good. He only got 33% of the Asian vote. And I think one story there is just that, even if you do have based immigrants, they have kids, and their kids assimilate into the broader woke culture.
Maybe we should have a larger scale.
Well, go on. Okay, I'll do it. Fine, I'll say. So there was a poll that came out, I think in 2019, right before COVID, that got a lot of people's eyes popping out of their heads. It was a Fox poll that showed that one of the questions they asked was, do you think the American founders were more heroes or villains? Traditionally in the past when that question has been asked, the people who say villains are single digits. So it's like your Howard Zinn voters, which are not a big voting bloc. But the reason everybody freaked out is because the share of Gen Z respondents who said the American founders were villains, close to 40%. 40% of young people are more likely to say that the American founders were villains than heroes. And a lot of people thought, oh, well, that's because these kids today, they're being taught all the wokeness in the school and the critical race theory. That must be what it is. Actually, that was most of the story. If you look at the breakdown of the poll and who it was saying that the founders were villains, it was a composition effect. The share of white respondents who responded villains still down in the single digits. It's Gen Z is the most diverse generation, naturally, that we've had in America so far, and that diversity is where the people giving the villain response were coming from. So I don't think the young children of immigrants are all that based. I really wish they were. And even the based ones still vote for the Democratic Party, so their basedness is not doing me or the cause any good. So that's my skepticism.
I gotta push back on that. I mean, where would the anti-affirmative action cause be if not for our Asian immigrants? It seems to me like immigrants, as you said earlier, there's a lot of trade-offs. They bring some bad cultural traits and they bring some good ones. But what are the most important ones? It seems like they do seem to like America a lot more than a lot of people I talk to.
Not our founders, apparently.
Was that immigrants or just like ethnic composition?
Ethnic composition.
I mean, I'm a loyalist, so I also agree. Conversations with the leftists. You're too right, you're too left.
But other cultural traits like risk-taking. Americans right now don't seem to take a lot of risks. They don't move very often. They stay in the states where they were born. Immigrants don't. They take risks. They start companies. They move around, and that kind of dynamism seems to me, anyway, outweigh some of the negative cultural traits that we might be concerned about. And again, forgive this calculus because anyone would be lying to you who says it's all good or all bad. But I think the most important cultural factors to me are creating a young, dynamic, risk-taking America. And there, I think immigrants help us in space.
I mean, my main response is that those poll numbers are all endogenous to how Republicans present themselves and present their administration. You know, the fact that a majority of immigrants voted for Stephen Harper back in the day was because they worked on it, right? Like Jason Kenney, his number 2, was learn Vietnamese. So you go to the Vietnamese suburbs and talk to them about like how we're going to make it easier for you to work at the doctor by like streamlining the language. So it doesn't, when I look at the first order effect of the Trump presidency, it's been to completely polarize the issue of immigration on a left and right dimension, while giving the ACLU record donor numbers, right? So there's a question between like what the kind of virtues they signal, right? And there's sort of a right-wing version of virtue signaling as well as left-wing, and the actual outcomes of those effects, right? And so you don't need to be like Jeb Bush bragging about his wife's guacamole, but there's many gradations in between where actual outreach among conservatives to Asian Americans, to other minority groups, can actually shift those poll numbers and make them not a company.
The best guacamole is at Trump Tower.
Because of all the illegal immigrants working there.
Just 2 quick points on Republican outreach to Asians. Glenn Youngkin did that, and it did him zero good at all. He was moderate. He did deliberate outreach to Asian Americans and didn't work. So something failing once doesn't mean it will fail forever, but just it's notable that it failed once when it mattered. The other reason to be skeptical that the Republican Party could do better with Asian immigrants if they just tried harder is that you see the same pattern in pretty much every Western democracy. Australia, where I spent much of the last decade, also has large Chinese and Indian immigrant populations, also large Middle Eastern populations. They're all completely in the bag for the left-wing parties. Even in the UK, where a lot of people seem to suggest that the Conservatives are doing well with Indian voters. Not that well, and overwhelmingly Asian, British voters of Asian ethnicity are close to 70% for the Labour Party. So if you see the same pattern in every country, in ones where the Conservative Party looks like ours and Donald Trump, and also in places where the Conservative Party is lame and squishy and does all kinds of multicultural outreach every day, as in Australia and Britain. If you see the same pattern everywhere, then it may just be a quality of the immigrants that you're taking and their children. And it's not unnatural, right? It's a fundamental premise of the left-wing party that people who, of ethnic minorities should get special favors, should be treated differently under the law. And the response of the Republican Party to that is, my counterbid is nothing. You get nothing special for your ethnicity. I mean, you can't beat something with nothing.
Just say, you're saying it's genetic, right? And I don't think genetics make you a fiscal liberal and a social liberal and a fiscal conservative. Like that's not in our genes. And all that stuff is very malleable. And it's also, again, endogenous to, not being, the problem with the virtue signaling aspect of the Republican Party on immigration has been that it's sort of the worst of both worlds. They will, Trump had fewer ICE raids than Obama, but gets presented in the media as being this like hardliner on immigration, right? Whereas he's taking meetings with the National Restaurant Association, which employs 10% of the entire hospitality and restaurant industry is undocumented immigrants. The reason we can't actually have employer-level enforcement, which is the only solution, the only scalable solution to enforcement, is because it affects Republican interest groups. Not only that, but it takes an administrative state, right? The deep state. Like the reason Canada has such strong enforcement is because we have a well-funded independent bureaucracy that does the enforcement. right? And so you're both trying to deconstruct that state, the administrative state, while at the same time, letting in, being as basically as open borders as Obama, if not more so, but just pairing that with rhetoric that alienates potential voters who probably agree with you on a majority of issues. I don't understand the logic behind that. It's suicidal.
I think it's one last undercurrent to immigration policy before we open it up to broader questions. I want to talk about national security, which you guys have all written about in various contexts. People bring it up on the southern border, people bring it up in reference to high-skilled immigration and international students. People argue that bringing in more immigrants of various kinds might bolster national security or that it might compromise it. So how do you guys assess those arguments? What should policymakers do to minimize security risks and maximize the benefits of immigration that we might find in those fields? Helen, would you like to start?
Sure. I think national security is a very good reason to reduce our reliance on foreign graduate students, foreign STEM workers. It's interesting to look at the state of that debate. What are the two sides? What are they arguing about? One of the things that is being debated now in terms of national security and STEM workers is the China initiative. The China initiative was something launched by the Donald Trump Justice Department under Attorney General Jeff Sessions to investigate technology theft, the sharing of intellectual property, and espionage by American academics with Chinese institutional affiliations. It's very common for them to partner with Chinese universities or research labs, and the China initiative was looking into whether or not scientists in those kinds of partnerships were sharing data that they shouldn't have. And that was reasonable because the number of people who have been prosecuted for espionage on behalf of China in the preceding 4 years was 0. So they said, well, there's clearly not 0 espionage going on. In fact, we have reason to think there's quite a lot. Let's go look for it. The response from the left was to say, that's racist. You are ethnically profiling Chinese scientists, which is not the case. The China initiative investigated people on the basis of their actions, not their ethnicity. And one of the biggest fish that they caught, because they did catch quite a lot and got a lot of prosecutions out of that, was the white guy, Lieber, up at MIT, the white chemist. So this was not by any means a get Chinese researchers program. And then in response to this outcry against the China initiative and its supposed ethnic profiling, the Biden administration did cancel it. They canceled the China initiative. They said, we're sorry, we apologize for having ethnically profiled all you Chinese people, we won't do it again. And even still, today, there are stories that pop up on my newsfeed all the time saying that Chinese scientists are feeling unwelcome because of the China initiative. Another Trump administration measure that was perfectly reasonable was that Chinese graduate students, or Chinese students seeking graduate study here in the United States, who had graduated from institutions in China affiliated with their military, could not come here and study sensitive topics vital to our national security. That was just too high risk. This was a measure that affected maybe 3,000 to 4,000 graduate students and applicants. And yet again, the people screamed bloody murder and said that this was a crazy, horrible, xenophobic measure. So I think it's clearly something that we as a nation have to be concerned about as tensions with China rise. And something for people here to keep in mind as you follow stories on this subject is that one side, the Trump side, thinks that we should be investigating these kinds of things and we should go after scientists who are behaving suspiciously or who have about whom we have incriminating evidence, even if they happen to be ethnically Chinese. And the other side apparently thinks that the correct number of espionage prosecutions in a 4-year span is 0, or who thinks that going after Chinese scientists about whom we have reason to have suspicions is in itself per se racist, and that even when we cancel that program, we're going to continue complaining about racism. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there is a very powerful side of this debate that thinks concerns about national security and high-skilled graduate students and workers is a non-issue. You should not worry about it at all. And if you do worry about it, that is per se evidence that you're a racist. So, yeah, that's when one side of the debate is taking such an extreme position, that to me is reason to embrace the other position all the more.
Jim?
I think about the challenge of China. Right now, as of just a couple of years ago, they've started graduating more STEM graduates than the United States. We can talk all day about the quality of those graduates, but they can get to triple that number very quickly, maybe even higher. And if the United States has any chance of staying ahead of a STEM workforce in our adversarial country that dwarfs our STEM workforce by many times, we're going to lose. We're not going to be able to stay ahead on the technological areas that we need to stay ahead on. But if we have the world's talent on our side, we can get by with a much smaller population and still be way ahead out on science and technology. I totally agree that there are legitimate concerns about espionage, and it sounds like counter-espionage investigations are the way to address that, not through broad-based immigration restrictionism. I think, yeah, restricting members of authoritarian parties, restricting people with backgrounds in with the Chinese military or the universities that are associated and affiliated with the Chinese military. That makes a lot of sense. That can be paired with not turning away the kinds of people who we currently educate here to go work for our adversaries. I think that would be really shooting ourselves in the foot. As Helen has brought up a number of times, right now among STEM graduates, about half are foreign-born, it's even higher in certain occupations or certain subfields. How well are we going to do at standing up to China without those people? I think quite poorly.
Again, I find myself sort of in this weird position where, I agree Joe McCarthy gets a bad rap, but on the other hand, the American supremacy in missile technology and so forth was owed a lot to Soviet immigrants. And okay, a handful of them are commies. We still, at the end of the day, it matters who's their friends. And so there's sort of another double-edged nature to this question where, yes, if on the one hand, when Hong Kong is protesting, or if there's, God forbid, an attempted invasion of Taiwan, that's an opportunity for us to really kneecap China in the talent market by saying, look, any Hong Kong protester that wants to come to the United States should get a green card, and we're going to use a special program. These are people who are driven, who love American values, right? And yes, that opens the risk that there will be one or two who are plants on the Chinese Communist Party. There are ways to deal with those issues, and in fact, coming to the United States is already such a burden. If you've ever tried, if there are other immigrants in the audience, immigrating to the United States is this paperwork nightmare. Part of that is submitting to a lie detector test. I don't think that's actually adding that much more of a burden. And I think the upside is actually so much greater than the downside, especially when we have conservatives who are wanting to pardon Julian Assange and Edward Snowden and these other white leakers of national secrets, who I agree with. I think they should be pardoned, right? But so what, right? When it comes to the bigger national security questions, I think about AI, right? And you look at the big AI companies right now. Probably the biggest national security question of this century will be who develops super AI first. And we're vastly in the lead in China, in part because of people like Ray Brockman, Ilya Sutskever, Jeffrey Hinton. These are some of the lead scientists at Google, DeepMind, OpenAI. Guess what? They all started in Canada because they applied to be H-1Bs in America and they get rejected, and so they ended up going to Canada for a bit. That's what we're going to be missing out on. And for the Catholics in the audience, we all have this concept of the convert zeal, right? Like, some of the most patriotic people in this country are immigrants, and that's because they didn't grow up here. It's literally because they didn't grow up here. They had to learn the reasons and values of America as adults and be converted in a way that was more true to the origin story of this country. And that's a massive opportunity cost if we just project that policy on the fear that there will be a few anecdotes here or there.
But it's more than a few anecdotes. I think we have to get used to the fact that we are living in a new era. Even as recently as 10 years ago, you could pretty much guarantee that a STEM graduate student from China, given the option of staying here in the United States, would take that option. Living in the United States was just a lot nicer than living in China. Your quality of life is going to be better. Not just because you have freedom, but just basic quality of life stuff. Now, I think larger numbers of Chinese STEM graduate students upon graduation are choosing to go back to China because more interesting things are happening there, because they have more family ties, and because the quality of life, if you're, it's a wealthier country, so it is no longer a no-brainer to come to America and live here if you have that chance.
I think that's completely false. I think there are people who are worried that America has given up on immigration and have that part of it, but the typical person in an H-1B waiting list from China, their parents are imploring them, do whatever you can to stay in China. The typical Chinese, middle-class Chinese person is terrified at what Xi Jinping is doing. He's centralizing power. He's sort of bringing back kind of Maoist economy, national champions. They do not see opportunity, long-run opportunity in China in the same way that they see this, relative to what they see as opportunity in America. And I think the fundamental premise during the Cold War was that this fundamental yearning for freedom to be able to create and not be coerced was not an American value, but a fundamentally human value. And sometimes it's hidden away or locked up behind culture, stuff like that. But I think it's true in China. Like there are millions, probably tens of millions, hundreds of millions of Chinese who have that in them and are not getting it in their own government. And we need to at least provide a valve for the regime. And when you look at core technologies, something like AI, I brought up already, there are probably like 500 people that if they died in a plane crash, tomorrow they'd be a big plane, that they die in a plane crash, like AI progress would slow down dramatically, right? And talent really is very concentrated. And so this goes again to the two debates about both scale and selection. But on the question of selection, we can do a lot to undercut Chinese leadership in various technological sectors by giving an open door to their best people. And it's something that we may need, right? So we're just doing this $50 billion chips bill, and we're building chip factories across the country. But it's not a matter of money, right? Like the way semiconductors are the most complex manufacturing process in human history. TSMC in Taiwan, has 70,000 people work there. It benefits from the fact that they have 14-year-olds who know they're going to be semiconductor engineers. They have this huge talent pipeline, and the way other countries have industrialized, the way sort of industrial policy works, right, is developing countries learn. Korea, for example, brought German auto engineers to Korea, the same as Japan, and those engineers helped transfer the skills that were lacking, the tacit knowledge that you can't just download off the internet. We should be doing the same in China. There's a huge manufacturing push happening in America right now, and on the right in particular, this idea that we need to build again but there's many areas in the American economy where the skills have atrophied in how to do that building. And so we should not shy away from bringing people from Taiwan and mainland China to the United States to transfer those skills, right, and become engineers here. And it doesn't mean millions of people, but the national security risks from not doing that are greater than doing it.
I think this is a good place for us to stop for just a beat. We have some food for thought on the table, and we'll start taking some questions. But first, let's give them a round of applause. Emma, you're our master of ceremonies. Just 3 or 4 or 5.
No?
10.
Yeah. No, I mean, does anybody have any questions?
Avery.
Okay. Yeah, so I enjoyed the conversation. I wrote down my questions for Sam, since he has been the self-appointed center today. 2 points. First, we mentioned social linguist immigration, pointing out McCarthy gets a bad rap. Now, the writer Pierre Varick made this exact connection, pointing out that the rising ethnic diversity and tolerance in 1950s America went hand in hand with deep social conformity and distrust of theological distance. So in other words, McCarthyism and ethnic diversity went hand in hand in Varick's view. He called this trans tolerance. Do you think a similar phenomenon explains the Democratic Party's transformation and the party of Bill Clinton was today? That is, it's grown more ethnically diverse and it's gotten more socially progressive and more socially enabled to disagree about things within its ranks? The second question I have is E-Verify. You describe this as a Canadian solution to an American problem. And while I share your enthusiasm on paper, I think in practice it's quite impractical, right? At this point, there are millions of unauthorized immigrants who have lived here for over a decade, who have American children, American wives and husbands, who would be rendered unemployable overnight. Given the reality of internal enforcement in America compared to Canada, and as you correctly note, that's way lower than it was in the Bush years, isn't it more plausible what we'll see happen is something like the RAISE Act, reduction in legal immigration, coupled with the de facto amnesty? So I'm curious for your thoughts on both of those points.
All right, in reverse order, I care about the long term, right? And so if you could make an argument that if we're going to compare them from 1 million to 500,000, that buys us the opportunity within the immigration system and bring in these other enforcement measures, then I would take that deal. Because in the long term, there will be a settlement on these, especially on the amnesty issue, and it will make it easier going forward to eventually increase your numbers. Being intellectually honest, I don't think it's necessary to do that. Maybe necessary in a political sense to signal that you're committed or that you're credible, but not in a very policy sense. On the McCarthy, what was the word used?
Trans tolerance.
Trans tolerance. So, America has its mythos as a melting pot, right? And Canada, the myth is that we're a mosaic, sort of the positive of that. And the outcome of that is that in America, you have more resistance to multiculturalism, whereas in Canada, multiculturalism gets associated with sort of like accommodation. We're going to let the Amish be the Amish, and Sikhs be the Sikhs, right? And what that means is by sort of outwardly signaling that you can live your culture the way you want to be, you don't have to become an uncontact Native American. The reverse actually ends up happening, where people feel more comfortable entering civic life, and then actually end up integrating more fluidly. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I think a lot of American politics comes down to just like fundamentally, especially in the immigration issue, fundamentally incompatible imperatives where people are trying to sort of like pull and push at the same time. They want to have, strong employment verification, but don't want to fund the agencies to do it, right? And so that's something that ought to resolve domestically. And I agree, there's probably not many settlements. Jeremy and others know that they've been debating these issues for decades. In the background of having a large population in Carter. So, probably we'll need a mix in the China kind of thing, where like we need someone who does amnesty but also cares about enforcement, like really
Yeah, hey. So just listening to all the different perspectives, and particularly the pro, where it stands for the third wave perspective, as I label it that. Is this sort of making the best of a broken system, right? Like, we need these engineers because we have an education system that's incapable of training engineers. We're on a gold agenda that can create an American populace capable of, that sort of seems like the dark underlying theme of all this. Like, if we don't import Chinese and Indian high school immigrants, we're doomed because our education system is not exist. Is this sort of the best thing we can do now? Is there some sort of policies that need to be implemented to make ourselves less dependent on importing people from all over the place?
I'm happy to take that first. I think there's a false dilemma to either have domestic skilled workers or international skilled workers. I mean, if anything, I think having international students right now subsidizes the tuition for natives to get educated on these issues in semiconductor manufacturing. Right now, the world's talent in that field is located in Taiwan. If we want to train the next generation of semiconductor professionals here in the United States, they're going to need to work side by side on the lines with people with experience. And right now, that experience is broad. I think upskilling the American workforce is going to be critical to advancing science and engineering in the 21st century. I think an ingredient in that is immigration. And if we also just increase the denominator, that also helps us to have more people, more minds thinking on these problems. Because when you think about how innovation actually happens, and not just how many inputs can we enter into the economic machinery, but how do we make the economic machinery more effective? More minds working on the problem is going to be helpful.
Yeah, the challenge with this issue, of course, is that you need to fix the education pipeline. But even if you do fix it to perfection, you have a 100% effective reform program that does exactly what you want it to do, you're still not going to see the effects for 20 years. And of course, your fix is inevitably not going to be. So that's the challenge. And if you need a genuine guest worker program in the interim, I can imagine versions of that I have to live with. The reason why the H1, one of the many reasons why H1 is such a challenge in this debate is that it's a non-immigrant visa. It's meant to be people who come here temporarily and then go home. But very often their employers will sponsor them for a green card, so it ends up being a permanent immigration. Just to give you some idea of the scale of the numbers, because India, of course, dominates that particular visa and a lot of high-skilled immigration in general. The Indian population in the United States in 1990 could be measured in the hundreds of thousands. It was very, very small. The Indian American population today, only one generation later, maybe 1.5, is 4.5 million, getting close up to 5 million. So that's a huge expansion. So this is you don't want to do something that's going to have permanent effects to fix a temporary problem. If somebody on the pro-immigration side wanted to propose a genuinely temporary fix while we got the education pipeline in order, yeah, I can imagine doing that.
Let's take one more question. Sam.
So there's a lot of debate about slunchism with how we can reform the composition of immigrants that come in here. But let's say that we have the current immigration as it is, but we increase the levels of it. In order to best minimize the risks and maximize the benefits, we increase or we reduce immigration, but all else stays the same.
I don't think I understood that.
So we have majority family-based, like we have today. We have our skills-based, that's a minority of immigration. But we scale it up or reduce it. Which do we need to do to maximize the benefits or minimize the risks?
I mean, I think the political science sort of consensus, I don't know, maybe consensus is a strong word, but the strong view in political science is that opposition to immigration does not come per se from the race, so much as perceptions of how in control we are of immigration. Is the immigration that's happening something we're choosing as a the general will, or is it something that's sort of being forced upon us because of the chaos of the border, right? And I think that's at heart one of the core issues in the United States, where actually the chaos of the border, drives a ton of Breitbart views, right? But that's actually not why we have such a large undocumented population. Right? That's mostly visa overstays. But that perception is important, and you need to, in some ways, probably overextend on enforcement and control to reestablish a perception that immigration that's occurring is immigration that's happening because we choose it to happen. And then the question becomes the levels. And I think actually when you reestablish control, and a sense of control, it actually opens up the degrees of freedom to increase the levels and to start asking these questions about competition. I think the family reunification, family chain migration, family-based immigration debate is tricky in the United States because if you say we want to do immigration that's sort of rooted in the values or in what our citizens want, there's two senses in which you can mean that. There's the one sense in which we can decide as a nation to have an economic national strategy around immigration, we want to bring in certain people, or you can say that individually, as individuals, if you are a second generation or first generation immigrant, that you can bring your grandparents or their cousins or whatever. Like that's in its own way an extension of decision-making power to our citizens. And that's been such a long-standing norm in the United States. I think it would be a culture shock to suddenly shift to a different system. But again, I think the border issue ends up being overrated because it's not actually where most undocumented come from. And I'd be more than happy to send Palmer Luckey down there with a bunch of killers drones and rods from God and just make sure to lock that shit down, right? And then from then on, say, okay, maybe you're third cousin twice removed, and you shouldn't necessarily get to come, ride on your coattails to the United States. But on the other hand, we're going to increase the rate and bring in people who will, based on some strategy, actually contribute to the bigger act.
Any last thoughts?
I don't have anything to add to that image.
In that case, I think we'll end it there. We'll continue the conversation over There Will Be More Dreams. Emma?